and welcome to another Suffolk Handicrafts video. This one is for September, and we are going to be making little witch hats, or witch hats of any size. I today will be making a little one, just in interest of not using up too many of the materials, and also so that you can actually see what I'm doing and not just see a big swath of black fabric in our overhead. But here is the mini version that I'm going to be making today of the full-sized version that you will get to make on your own time. We are getting very close to spooky season. I know it's September, we might not want to think about the summer ending, but this summer ending means that we get to move into spooky season. And I don't know about you, I always am super late on putting together a costume for myself. So if I just make a hat, I have enough clothing in my closet that is black, or I can throw together a sort of witchy outfit, and this will do me. But you can also customize it. You can make it very special. I have this little, fake flower that we can add to it and make it kind of a cute garden witch, or you could add fake cobwebs, and we'll talk more about kind of embellishments or things that you could do towards the end. But we'll talk about sizing and how you're going to make your pattern, because this will be a very interesting project for anyone who has never made patterns before, and a very good one to start, since it's a pretty simple pattern, but it will require you to do a little bit of math and a little bit of pattern making. So it'll be a good one to start and sort of dip your toes in that water. And so you can make it for yourself, your little ones, cats and dogs perhaps. If you make it for little ones, I would recommend perhaps adding a bit of elastic underneath. But for adults, it will be fine to just sit straight on the head. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so what you can see here are all of our supplies for this project, and very specifically the supplies that you will get if you get a kit of supplies from Suffolk Public Library. We are doing all of our kits first come, first served for this project, so you don't have to register. You can just walk right up to the locations and ask for a kit, and if we have any remaining, you can absolutely get one. So we are providing everything for you to do this as a hand sewing project. You can absolutely do this as a machine project. We also have machines that you can borrow and check out. If you would like to do this as a machine project, maybe you're short on time, or you want to work on getting a machine, but you perhaps don't have one, or yours is in disrepair. So all of those are available to you through Suffolk Public Library, and you can get those checked out. But what we have in this kit today is going to be more specifically for a hand sewing version of this project. So we have our felt that we are going to be using. We are going to be using a pretty thick felt, just so that it has the structure to be able to stand up on its own. We want a nice tall witch hat that will stand up and have structure and not just immediately flop over. So we're looking for something that's, fairly thick and has a nice feel to it. And we will also have a needle for you, a needle threader in case that's helpful for you, some thread, and then some pins. Some things that will be helpful or you might need for this project, but we are not including, are a pair of fabric scissors. You will absolutely need these. Either some tailor's chalk, a chalk, or a fabric marker, fabric pen, something like this for when you are marking your pattern on your fabric. I'd recommend something in a light color since we are doing this on a black fabric. If you have any preference towards any other type of clip, say wonder clips, clips like these, anything like that, since this is a fairly thick fabric, it might be helpful to do that versus the pins here. it's entirely up to your preference. And then for when you are doing the pattern making itself, I'm just going to be using a regular ruler like you would see in a classroom, but a sewing ruler would be useful as well. So those are the materials that we'll be using today. Of course, up to your discretion of whether you would like to use a sewing machine or not. But let's get started, and the first thing we're going to be doing is making our pattern and firstly measuring ourselves or whoever is going to be the little witch of the day. Alright, and here is where some of the math comes in, and we're really going to be doing some of the most challenging part of making our pattern. And we are going to start with measuring our heads and the circumference of our heads. So, and I forgot to mention that a tailor's tape or a tailor's tape measure is going to be the most useful thing here. So you will just wrap it around your head right where you want that hat to sit, and I'd recommend adding like an inch or so, maybe just a half an inch depending on how tightly or loosely you want your hat to sit. Remember, felt doesn't really have much of a give, so I would err on the side of giving yourself both seam allowance and some room to breathe. You don't want your hat sitting on you for potentially a good while, as tightly as you are going to be holding your tape measure to measure your head. So I'm going to walk you through the steps of doing the measurements and doing all of the math for making our pattern. And then again, like I said, my pattern is going to be quite small, but when I measured my head, it was right at 22 inches for the circumference, and I'm going to go ahead and add a half an inch extra for comfort, and then another half an inch for seam allowance. So I'm going to go all the way up to 23 inches right here for my head circumference. So head diameter, you're going to get that. So for the diameter, we are going to get that by dividing the circumference by pi. So 23 divided by pi is, let me just check my calculator here, it is roughly 7.32. And for the brim, this is one that you get to kind of choose yourself. How wide do you want your brim to be off of the edge of your head? And this is something that you can kind of take your ruler and estimate. How far off do you want that to, hang off of the edge of your head? And, I might go for a 6-inch addition, which you can just simply add 6 inches to either side of your 7-inch diameter. If you think about it like a circle, basically a donut, your head diameter is the diameter of the donut hole, is the full width of just that donut hole, and then we're going to be looking at the full width all the way across, and the overhang of just one of the distances between, the interior of that donut hole and the edge of the donut, or just the length of what we might think of the brim as. So if we say that, We think of this as 6 inches here from my head to the edge of the brim. And so that's going to be the same on the other side. So 6 and 6 would be 12, and then add in our interior head diameter, which we know to be 7.32, and that comes to 13.32. So this is going to be the full width of the full diameter of what we need to cut out for the entire circle. And now moving on to the cone, which is going to be a bit more complicated than just the brim. So first we need to decide on how tall we want the hat to be, so just decide on a height. Again, this is something that you can take your ruler and kind of set it on top of your head. How tall do you feel like you kind of want your hat to be? I might go for, say, an 11-inch, not super, super tall, but tall enough that it's, it's going to stick up a little bit. You'll still get a decent height. So say 11 inches is nice there. And then you're going to divide just our head diameter here, this 7.32 number that we have, in half. So 7.32, and this is, have no shame in using your calculators here for any of this. So our head, and to get our radius, because we want to get our radius of our head so that we can use this for determining things about our cone. So our head radius is going to be 3.66. And then we're going to get the slant. And this is an interesting bit of math here. So we're going to do the square root of the radius squared plus the height squared. So we're going to take our 11 and our 3.66, square each of those. So 3.66 is our radius, square it, and then our 11, square it, and then get the square root of each of those. So it gets a bit complicated. We're doing a good bit of math. I hope you remember your high school or potentially college math, but probably high school. I hope you remember your math, or at least have a calculator handy. And it's all gonna work out because it's going to actually help us so that we don't have too many sloppy seams or anything like that. So right, so my 3.66 squared is 13.395 plus squared 121. We're gonna I'm going through this step by step. I hope everybody is able to follow along. And happy to step in and answer any questions or solve any solutions here. And I'm also going to provide you with like a little cheat sheet of what these equations are in your kit as well. So, what does the circumference mean? It means to measure your head. What does the diameter mean? It means to divide it by pi. So a little cheat sheet of what you should be doing with some of the math, because the math can get a little complicated, and certainly for a first-time pattern maker, it can be a little heavy. So my cone slant is ending at about 11:59 here. So your cone slant and your cone height should be fairly similar with this type of pretty short radius that we're going to be working with. So if you see that and you think, my slant isn't very much different from my height, that's good. You're probably ending up in the right place. So once you have this set of 6 numbers, you are ready to start actually marking your pattern onto paper. And that's the fun part. All right, so here is what might be new for some of you if you have never made a pattern before, starting from completely scratch. So we have all of our numbers here on our other sheet, but we need to turn them into a shape that we can actually cut out of fabric. So we can start with the cone, since it's going to take up quite a bit of room. So we'll start, and we're actually going to take that cone slant number and measure that out. So the cone slant that we calculated was 11:59. Again, yours might be different if you want either a taller or shorter cone. If your head was a different size, we were making it for a child, perhaps. Whatever it is, you're going to use your calculations to make it fit you specifically. That's one of the really nice things about getting to make something for yourself and getting to start it from scratch, is that you get to make things exactly the way that you want them, and you don't have to buy something off the rack and say, oh, well, it's fine, and you get to really make it perfect and exactly the way you want. So with 11, and we'll call it 11.6, and we do always, with this, we want to add a seam allowance, because again, felt doesn't really stretch, and we want to add in that seam allowance so that there is room for us to actually do our sewing. So we're going to add, I'm just going to add 1/4 of an inch since I'm going to be hand sewing. I don't need that much. If you are machine sewing, or if you're not as comfortable with machine sewing particularly, you're welcome to add a little bit more. You can always trim it after, but I would recommend you going on the smaller side for seam allowances on this project in particular, just because we're not working with something that is going to be particularly that hides seams particularly well. So going with something that has a smaller seam allowance means that we will have smaller and thinner seams and less bulky seams to hide. So I'm just going to measure a line, and I'm going to start at the edge of my paper since I know that I'm going to have a shape that's basically an arc that kind of needs to reach most of the way around the paper. So I'm gonna start here just to try and get as much on the paper as I absolutely can, and measure from here. And I'm actually going to do the full line here. There we go. And slightly made a shift, but it's all right. And what we're going to do is we are going to keep one of our points of our ruler here and just keep arcing our ruler and just making little dots or little notches so that we can tell that we would have that right length in a nice big arc all around the paper. If you want to get really fancy, you could measure some string and do a string tied to a pin and do an arc that way. That might be helpful, especially for the next one that we're doing, the brim, since sometimes doing circles is surprisingly difficult. And if you run out of space on your one sheet, that's all right. I'd recommend you can tape two together. For anyone who's picking up a kit, you'll have like very large pieces of paper for you to do this on, so you should have like extremely large drafting paper. But anyone who's doing this afterward, you can take a couple of like pieces of 11 by 17 and tape them together, and on the non-taped side, underneath, and try and put them together, and that should work for you. Alright, so I'm not going to make my other side quite yet, but I have dots all the way around my arc, and what I'm going to do, just for the sake of simplicity, is measure out along the length of my arc to find how far along I should stop, and try and stop along where my head circumference is. So I'm going to stop at where my circumference would be. So it's a tiny bit challenging using a straight ruler to measure an arc, but trust me, it is easier than using the tailor's tape, because it does not like to lay flat on anything if there isn't something holding it down. So my head circumference was at 23 inches, and I reached 12 here. I'm looking for another 11. Alright, so I'm going to make the end of mine right about here, and it's going to look quite large. Your cone is going to look really large. Alright, and then you're just going to fill in the arc. And try to hit those dots as closely as you can. It's alright if you are slightly on one side or the other, because when you cut them, remember, one pair of scissors for cutting paper, another pair of scissors is for cutting fabric. You don't want to dull your fabric scissors on paper. But when you cut this, you can trim it slightly closer to your dots if you went over, or vice versa. You can trim it more closely to your dots if you went underneath, perhaps. So here's our big arc. It almost struggles to fit in frame, but here's our big cone, and I promise I have a smaller version for the small cone that I'll be making. I actually have it already cut out, so here's the small version, but it'll look about like this for this, but just much larger. But here's what it'll look like. And now it's time to get started on the brim. There's less math, but making circles can be a little challenging sometimes. So for this, I actually would recommend you get 2 pieces of paper and tie them together and tape them together, because if you see, like, if I started in one, it wouldn't reach the edge, right? So I would recommend you put 2 sheets of paper together to, again, completely fill my frame here, but really give you enough space to make a circle that will be big enough to be your pattern. So you can tape them together, made a stray mark. Or again, if you're picking up a kit from us, we'll have some nice large paper for you. So this is, alright, so my trick for making circles and making them pretty accurate is going to require just a little bit of some of the thread that we're going to provide, or whatever thread you happen to have around, and a little bit of your tape. So it might not look like it to you, but this is the center of my paper. I've got a nice big sheet of paper, and I'm just going to tape my thread down here. It doesn't have to be super pretty. We're going to pull it up, and this is our pattern piece anyway. But I'm going to use this as my center point of my circle. And now when I go to make it, I'll be able to turn it all the way around, keeping the tension tight. So all we need to do is check for both now we're going to actually check the head radius, which is not the centimeters, but the inches. And the head radius is 3.6. So we're looking here. All right. And again, a couple stray marks. We want to add a tiny bit of seam allowance. On this side, we're going to add it onto the interior, so we're going to make this a little bit shorter, and this will give us that little bit of extra seam allowance for when we join the brim to the cone later, because that's going to be the trickiest part of this project. So I'm going to edge slightly closer to this half mark. And what I'm going to do, just for my sanity, is just make a knot right at that measurement point, if this will agree with me. That way I can find my measurement pretty easily again. And we're just going to walk this back 2, and we're just going to make that knot right there on our measurement. So this way we can usually you would tie your string around your pencil and go all the way around. Since we're making a couple of circles, I'm trying to avoid having to do that. But if it decides to be annoying, we see if just a loop will do to hold it in place. This is something that's easier if you can also need tension on, yep, we are going to need to tie this into place, just so that we don't actually lose our place. So, lessons learned. Alternatively, if you have a large printer, you can actually get your measurement and just print this out, but this is what we're going to be doing to be making this by hand. Alright. And thinking about this now, I should have started with the long one so that I could just cut him free. But sometimes you need to make mistakes in order to learn from them. So, alright. Here we are, we're matching our point. And there's our circle. It's not the prettiest, but it will do. And then what we can do is we can actually change where. Leave this still in his loop. And then just change on the length of the string where it was placed. So we wanted to add about 6 inches to the actual length of the brim. So that puts us at about a 9.5 inch brim from center point for the brim radius. So let's go ahead and measure that out. There we go. And we'll just take that down. If you have a preferred way to make your circles, if you have, for instance, a very large compass or something, you're absolutely welcome to use that. This is just a little trick that can be handy when it decides to stop being finicky. Oh, and when we are writing on the correct paper. There we go. All right. So it, again, it's quite large. It will look basically like a donut. And then we'll cut it out. And I recommend marking your pattern pieces. So for this one, you can write brim and mark how much seam allowance you left, etc., etc. And this is mostly helpful if you are making one for an adult and one for a child, and you can mark the difference between those. If you're only making one of these, it's pretty easy to tell which is the brim and which is the cone. But if you're making several and perhaps one of them has a specific measurement and the other is a slightly different, you want to make sure that you can tell those apart by the type, and marking that on the pattern paper is a pretty important part of that. So this is us making our pattern, and then we'll get to cutting the pattern out, and then we will mark this pattern on the fabric and actually cut out the fabric next. Alright, so now that we have our pattern pieces cut out, we are going to actually mark them on our fabric. And this is where it's going to be most helpful to have a fabric pen or even a piece of chalk, tailor's chalk, something like that. We've done projects in the past where we've taken regular pieces of like classroom chalk and just sharpened them with a manual pencil sharpener to get a nice sharp point. So you're absolutely welcome to do that. So we're going to just follow a line at the edge of our pattern. This, of course, is our cone. You want to get pretty close to the edge of your pattern piece because, of course, we did all of that work with our math to get it right. And if you're ever worried about whether you are making like a mark on your fabric, you can always just lift up just a corner of your pattern piece while holding it all flat. The big thing with marking your pattern pieces is making sure that your pattern doesn't shift while you are making your marks. Otherwise, you will get a wonky line when you end up actually cutting, even if you're following the line that you drew. So, there we go. There's our cone piece. We can set that aside, and we'll move over. And I recommend kind of trying to nestle it in. These shapes don't do quite so well for nestling as perhaps some others, but do your best, trying to minimize your scrap as much as possible. So we're going to make our big circle here all the way around what is going to be the outer brim. And then what we're going to do is, I actually haven't cut out the interior circle yet, sort of the circle of the inside of this donut here where your head is going to go, but we will do that. And just a gentle reminder that we will want to use separate scissors for paper that we do for fabric. Stopped marking. Sometimes that can happen. There it goes. Alright. Wonderful. Yes. So we want to use separate scissors that we use, separate scissors for fabric that we do for paper, because using them on paper can sort of dull them. And you don't want to use dull scissors on fabric because that can sort of pull up some of the fibers and you just don't get quite as clean of a line. So here's our outer rim line. I'm going to go grab my paper scissors, not my fabric scissors, I'm going to grab my paper scissors and cut the interior out of there. And just as you normally do, because it doesn't have to be exactly, we don't really care about the interior of our little donut. It's not the prettiest cut you've ever seen, but it will do the job. And remember, we're just going to line this back up with our line that we made previously and make just a line to be our spot where the cone will join the brim. Making sure that that joined up. All right. So now we are all done with the actual paper pattern pieces. We are ready to cut out with our fabric scissors. You're also welcome to use a rotary cutter and a board for this as well, if you prefer that. It's entirely up to you. But you want these cuts to be pretty clean as you can manage them, because especially with the outer edge of your brim, we are going to leave that one raw. Felt actually does a pretty good job of sealing itself, so we don't really need to create a seam there. You're of course welcome to add an extra seam if you would like, if you want to add a little bit of bulk, or you could even add a seam around a thin flexible wire if you wanted your brim of your witch hat to be a little bit posable. That would be an addition that you could add to make it a little bit flexible and posable, and it wouldn't just be kind of very floppy the way that ours is going to end up. All right, so there's our piece here, and we're going to cut here. I'm going to take my time going around the exterior, just because we are planning on leaving this raw, and you're always able to clean this up as well. Something to note when you're using pens or chalk or anything like that to mark your pattern is to know how to get rid of the lines. So some good number of them are water soluble, or they might be heat soluble. They might disappear under heat. So give them a quick run under a low temperature iron and that'll do the trick. Sometimes even just a quick blast with a hair dryer is enough for some of the heat ones. But knowing what your tools in particular and how they work. We're going pretty gently around the exterior. There we are. Now we're just going to cut out this center, and I'm going to do similar to the last. I'm going to do a quick closer. If it will agree with me. Maybe I need to do more. There it is. Alright. Yeah, this felt is fairly thick, so you might, when you're cutting out your center hole, you might need to take a few runs at it like I did, and you want to do that gently, since this will be a seam that is pretty important to the structural integrity. There we go. It's cutting all right now, though. So if you've ever cut fabric before, and especially cottons or things like that, you might be more used to seeing more fraying or just loose threads on the edge. And that's something that's nice about felt, is that it doesn't super do that. It's somewhat self-contained, self-healing. So that's part of why we're not going to be doing an exterior seam, but you are more than welcome to do so if you prefer. Alright, there we go. So now we have our two pieces, and we are ready to start actually sewing. Alright, so as we're getting started for the actual sewing piece, we are, as always, going to be sewing with our right sides together. And we're going to start with the cone here. I'm actually going to put the cone together with these clips. You're also welcome, and we will be including little pins for everybody, but I find that with this thick of a fabric, I like the clips a bit better. So I'm going to clip these together, just like so. Let me move this up a bit, actually. And make sure that your seam is completely straight. And if we measured and cut everything correctly, you should be able to draw a completely straight line from your point to the end of your slant, and everything should match up. So it's all looking good on this side, which is good news. And then you're just going to take your needle. For now, I'm actually just going to poke it right in here while I get my thread prepared. This is always the most challenging part. Alright. Feels like an eye test to get a needle threaded. Alright. So we've got our needle threaded. For hand sewing this, I'm going to do just a simple, let's go with a back stitch. You're welcome to do whatever type of stitch you'd like. Just know that if you do something that goes across these two, then you might get, or you're likely to get, some sort of visible stitch on the outside of your finished piece. So if you want that, that's great. If you would not like that, then maybe choose something that's going to keep your seam entirely inside your hat, and then we can trim off some of your excess of your seam afterwards. And if you're looking to do this as a machine project, because this is a thicker fabric, you can play around with your settings, but I would recommend doing a more sturdy needle, a higher gauge needle, and potentially doing a longer stitch setting. But that's, you can play around, see how you feel, what works for you. So we're just going to get started with stitching here. I'm doing this quickly. We have a few other videos on the channel that give you a little bit more information on how to do the actual stitches. So if you are interested in that information, absolutely welcome to do that. but in essence, what I'm doing here is creating a seam. And remember, we only left a pretty short seam allowance. So I'm pretty much only staying about like 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch into where we made this cut. All right. So I'm gonna finish up this seam and be back when it is time to turn this cone inside out. Alright, so now our seam on the cone is finished, and if you have any excess seam, just kind of like I do, or it's kind of bulky and you're worried about it looking a little bulky or clunky once you turn it over, you're absolutely welcome to take your scissors and just very carefully trim some of that excess. You don't want to trim into the seam itself, but you're welcome to trim some of that seam allowance, some of that extra fabric. Yep, you want to make sure that you're trimming on the outside of the seam still. I understand it's a little bit hard for you to see the black thread on the black fabric. But now that we are ready to get it attached to our brim, we are going to actually invert this. So we can start by just getting him flipped, and then it's going to be easiest if you get like a chopstick or a small wooden stick or turner, especially for the little end bit, the like very tip of this cone, and just help kind of gently prod it out and into the world. There we go. Now, if you wanted to have a very smooth surface here and not have it have this bump, you're absolutely welcome to do a very low heat iron here. I would just say start with a low heat, make sure and cover it with a protective paper or something, just so that you're not accidentally scorching your fabric here. So, yep, here we have our now right side out cone, and we are actually going to now still do right sides together and start to attach now with our pins, because here's where the clips get quite bulky. But if you're working on a larger hat, it might not. So I personally find this to be the hardest part of this project, is pinning the brim to the hat. So if you run into some issues with this, you are absolutely not alone. And you just want to pin those together like so. And I recommend just starting in one spot and going around from there. That way you don't accidentally, start in one spot, go across, and maybe you haven't quite lined them up correctly because they're being a little uncooperative for you. So if you start in one spot and kind of go around, it will line up a bit better. And again, we're just lining up these edges here because we did build in some seam allowance. So we should have room. And your brim is going to start folding up like this, and it's going to look quite a bit odd until you are nearly done actually sewing the seam and your brim can lay flat. It is going to look very silly, but by the time you are finished with it, it will actually lay flat. I promise. And use as many pens as you feel like you need. I am someone who is absolutely guilty of using so very many pins, especially with something that's kind of tricky like this, that doesn't like to lay flat. I like to have my pieces be pretty flat when I'm working with them. So, oh, it didn't come all the way through. Come all the way through. There we are. So we're just pinning this all around. And remember, you're wanting it to go through all of your layers. And matching up your edges of your fabric as well. Don't let them slip on you. They will want to do that. All right. So now that you've got it all pinned, it is going to look something a bit like this, where your brim is quite a bit more vertical than you might think of. That is absolutely fine. Once we actually have this seam done, it will not be like that. It will be actually laying flat and much more like this. So we'll get started on the sewing. This is where you can be very careful. Hopefully you have put the heads of your pins towards where you are actually sewing. That way you're a little less likely to accidentally poke yourself. And I recommend starting at your seam point here, where your seam matches, just so that when you're finishing everything up, you'll have an extra, you're not adding an extra point where there's extra bulk here. This would also be if you were looking to add any, say, elastic, if you were making this for a child or a toddler, or even, say, a pet, and you wanted to add a strap of elastic so that it would stay on their head, you would add it in this step and just add it into your pinned spots, and that way you could include it into this seam here. I haven't done this yet. I'm not doing that for this one, but you absolutely could. So then we're just going to do our seam all the way around. And for this one, I'm going to just do a quick whip stitch. It will be very easy, but again, you're welcome to do whichever you like. All right. And careful with catching your thread on the edge of your brim as I am doing, because it will want to do that. Right, so I will be back when it is time to pull these pins out and show off our finished piece, and we can talk about decorations and how you might want to finish it. Alright, see you in a minute. Alright, so we've finished our seam all the way around the edge here, and we just use a little bit of water to get rid of our marks from our pin as well. Now it's time to talk about how to finish this off. So you're absolutely welcome. You can leave it just a plain black classic witch cap. Absolutely fine. If you want to spice it up a little bit, one of the fun things about making something yourself is you get to make it exactly the way that you want it. So we've already talked about you could add an extra seam here and some flexible wire within if you wanted this to be like a flexible and moldable edge of your brim. This does have a little bit of hold to it, but part of why we chose the thicker felt is because of that hold that it has. You know, you can bend it and it'll hold a bit, but you're welcome to add that if you want it to definitely hold for you. You could add some extra embroidered elements to it if you wanted, especially if you wanted to give it like an extra hand-sewn note to it, really emphasize the element that you have created this yourself. I'm a bit partial to adding, you know, foliage or fake foliage might hold up a bit better than real foliage. It's a very nice, you know, adding a little sprig of this. If you were going to do this, I would recommend making just a small slice in either the very near the seam here on either the cone or the brim and poking this just through. And you can do that with your scissors or even the pointed part of a seam ripper to make just a hole. You can do a small splash of bleach. It will turn kind of a ruddy orange coming from it being black. It would be a very cool, very Halloween look. You can add in other, you know, ribbons, jewelry pieces draped around the brim. Truly, it is yours to create not only from scratch, but to turn from this into your own creation. So I hope this has inspired you to get creative with a, you know, what can be a pretty basic Halloween costume into something that is truly your own, and get excited for the season. Alright, thank you for joining us for this Suffolk Handicrafts project, and hope you look forward, as I do, to the next one. Have a good day.